It's a great pleasure to introduce Christopher Duggan, who I've known for a number of years now. And actually, this is the second time I've introduced him because we had a discussion of his book in New York. I can't remember when now. Was it last? Yeah, about a year ago now. A very lively sort of three-way discussion with a colleague, Molly Tambor from Long Island University. But I haven't heard this as a lecture, so I'm very excited about this format. Just to fill you in on who's about to speak to you, Christopher Duggan is Professor of Modern Italian History at the University of Reading in Britain. He's also director there of the Center for Modern Italian History. His books include a major biography of Francesco Crispi, a 19th century politician, sometimes called the Italian Bismarck. The Force of Destiny, History of Italy since 1796. Both these books also came out in Italian. A Concise History of Italy, originally published in 1994, just come out a few months ago, I think, in a new edition, up to the fall of Berlusconi. Well, let's hope. But the fall of the Berlusconi government at the end of 2011. And then a co-edited book with Stephen Gundel and Giuliana Pieri called The Cult of the Duce, which is the result of a long project that Christopher, Stephen and Giuliana co-directed with funding from a British Funding Council. Produced not just a book, to which I think Christopher wrote 3 chapters, but also 3 videos about Mussolini. And one of the chapters that Christopher wrote in that deals with the evidence of the cult of the Duce in letters and diaries. And as I understand it, it's really that project which has expanded into this book that he's going to talk about today, called Fascist Voices, An Intimate History of Mussolini's Italy, published in 2013 by Oxford University Press, published here in Italy by La Terza as Il Popolo del Duce, Storia emotiva dell'Italia fascista. The Italian edition, I was saying to Christopher and I share the dubious honor of both having our books stroncati by Emilio Gentile, a major historian of fascism. In both cases, I think a very wrong-headed critique of our work, but of course we would say that. Anyway, this is not what we're to talk about, but it's a kind of, that was the first blast of publicity. I think Gentile said one thing, though, that's actually quite interesting in the beginning of his long review, the rest of which I don't agree with, which is if you'd published it in the 70s, a book of testimonies and letters showing the degree of popular Italian support for Mussolini, it would have been very controversial. There was such a strong consensus then among historians on the sort of anti-fascist position, apart from, because the leading revisionist historian of fascism, Renzo De Felice, was trying to argue that there was a lot of popular consent for fascism, but the sort of the kind of post-resistance consensus among historians was that was really impossible, that the regime ruled through coercion, not consent. Any consent there was manipulated from above through the media. It wasn't spontaneously given. And that argument has never seemed completely convincing. And I think what Christopher's done brilliantly is to look at diaries, to look at letters, both by elites and some senior people in Italy, and some intellectuals, but also by ordinary people, ordinary Italians, to give evidence of the kind of nature of the cult of the Duce. So I won't say anything more. I think we'll have probably a lively discussion after the lecture, but I'll let you, Christopher, introduce this really, really exciting new work on attitudes towards Mussolini.
Good. Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you for the invitation to come here this evening. I've been here once before, and I was trying to remember exactly when. It was when Harold Acton was still alive, and I think it was back in August 1987, and I was doing work on southern Italy, and I wanted to come and talk to Harold Acton about the Bourbons of Naples, about which he had written, and he was very kind and gave me tea, and we chatted away about the Bourbons. At a certain point, he leaned across and said, "You're not by any chance related to that dear old friend of mine, the wonderful historical novelist Alfred Duggan, are you?" And I said, "No." And his face rather dropped, and he was slightly less interested in my research after that. Anyway, it's a great pleasure to be back here after so many years. And I want to begin on the 24th of September, 1938. A 23-year-old student of physics at the university, a highly intelligent young woman called Maria Theresa Rossetti, has had trouble sleeping the previous night. She's extremely excited. Benito Mussolini, the Duce, the man who has dominated Italy since the March on Rome on 28th of October 1922, is touring the region and is coming to give a speech in her town. That morning, 24th September 1938, she joins the massive crowds thronging the Prato della Valle, the largest public space in Italy. And this is what she hears and sees.
Questa Padova che mi ha oggi presentato le forze del regime in uno schieramento che io posso chiamare senza retorica semplicemente formidabile.
Maria Theresa had been keeping a diary ever since she was 11, and that evening she hurried to record her feelings in it. I did not miss a word of the speech or an expression on his face and came away with a marvelous impression. He is an exceptional man who emanates an immense force, capable of shackling endless multitudes. His face is unique and inimitable, full of strength and sweetness, hard and human. You should have seen how he smiled at the cheering crowd, with what perfect style he made the Roman salute. To behold that face is to feel ready for anything, for any sacrifice, for any struggle. I shouted and shouted so much that I lost my voice and was hoarse the whole day, but I felt such enthusiasm as I will never forget. And of course, this is a key moment in the lead up to the Second World War. The 24th September 1938, Mussolini is about to go off to Munich to try and avert war, but there is an atmosphere of impending war everywhere in Europe. Maria Theresa was evidently rather proud of the intensity of her response, her enthusiasm, a key word in the lexicon of fascism. And one reason for this, paradoxically, is that she'd had growing doubts in the preceding months about Mussolini and his regime. She'd become embarrassed by the party's drive in the course of 1938 to reform customs and to crack down on what was seen as overly bourgeois and unmanly practices, for example, handshaking. And she'd been angered a little over 2 weeks earlier by the introduction of the first set of anti-Semitic racial laws, which had seen a number of her Jewish professors at Padua forced out of their posts. Indeed, the brutal jolt of the racial laws had seemed suddenly to dispel the clouds of rhetorical fog that swirled around the regime, permitting her to see and describe for the first time clearly in her diary some of fascism's serious shortcomings. As she wrote on the 10th of September 1938, the most beautiful sentiments, love of the fatherland, of the family, of work, of humanity, have vanished beneath false ideas. Freedom of thought and the press is a meaningless word. Books and works of art must have one theme only, fascism and the Duce. The newspapers sing one chorus, adulation. Mussolini himself, whom I once admired as the most complete genius, seems to me to have lost his sense of equilibrium. Pity has been banished, and cruelty in the form of the campaign against the Jews has been elevated into patriotism. And yet, as we've seen, just 2 weeks later, she cheered and cheered Mussolini until she was hoarse. And she was clearly proud that she'd been able to do so. Maria Theresa's diary takes us somewhere near to the heart of Italian fascism, with its many paradoxes. It also highlights one of the great difficulties that historians face in addressing the issue of popular opinion under fascism. Aside from all the methodological problems posed by trying to gauge what ordinary people really thought and felt about a regime which, like other totalitarian states, provided no formal space for the exercise of public opinion, there's a very basic question of what we mean by fascism. Do we mean principally the policies of the regime, its economic and welfare measures, its demographic campaign to increase the country's population by 20 million in 20 years, its program of ruralization, the trade union reforms, its pursuit of colonies, or the racial laws and the reform of customs? Do we see the essence of fascism as lying with the fascist party? Do we put the accent on fascist ideology, and if so, which elements of fascist ideology, and make this a shibboleth for the assessment of popular opinion? Or do we concentrate, as Maria Theresa's passionate response to hearing the Duce speak might encourage us to do, on the figure of Mussolini and the extraordinary cult that surrounded him, and make this the litmus test for support for fascism. What I want to suggest here, on the basis of the hundreds of private diaries that I read when researching my last book, Fascist Voices, as well as other sources, such as secret police reports, the letters that poured in daily to the Duce via his private secretariat in Rome from ordinary Italians, is that on various levels, not least ideological, fascism resonated strongly with broad swathes of the Italian public. And the strength of this resonance was to be an important factor in how fascism was remembered and understood after 1945. The issue of the popularity of fascism has been subject of much debate and controversy. According to what one might call the semi-official interpretation of Italian fascism that emerged with the post-war republic, and which has been championed primarily, but by no means exclusively, by the left, Mussolini's Italy was an authoritarian and highly oppressive regime that was endured rather than supported by the mass of the population. Against this, there is what might be called the vulgate of the central right, peddled strongly after 1945 in popular magazines and popular histories, and which has received much new traction in the last 2 decades. According to this view, fascism was in general extremely popular, certainly until the late 1930s. And this popularity, it is claimed, was due to 2 main factors. First, in contrast to what the left alleged, that fascism was a benign and largely unoppressive regime. Second, and in contrast to Nazism, that it was devoid of any serious ideological content. Italians, in other words, liked fascism because it left them free to be what they'd always been, a people with a healthy skepticism of the state and more generally of politics, committed to their family, their friends, and their locality. They had ideological commitment and faith. It was not fascist faith, but traditional Catholic faith. There is no question that the material I use for Fascist Voices inevitably poses numerous methodological problems, and its representativeness, particularly in the case of diaries and letters, given the prevalence of illiteracy in Italy at this time, is also open to question. But there can be no doubt, or little doubt, that the issue of popular opinion is an important research question, not least given the longevity of the fascist regime in Italy, and given too, as is increasingly coming to be recognized, the fact that Mussolini's regime was a paradigm for a broad range of authoritarian and nationalist movements, not just in Europe, but also in South America and Asia during the 1920s and 1930s. However, it is striking that since Fascist Voices came out in Italian nearly a year ago, it's been greeted with almost total silence. This in marked contrast to the situation in other countries where it has been extensively reviewed and discussed. The only review of significance in Italy, as we mentioned, has been from Emilio Gentili. And in his opinion, the book is pointless. First, because there's no way, he says, that any historian can possibly gauge what millions of ordinary Italian people thought or felt under fascism, or indeed under any totalitarian regime. And secondly, and even more curiously, because in his view, it is, and I quote, an indisputable historical fact that no totalitarian regime has ever based its power on the consent of the common people, but only and always on the monopoly of political power by a single party, on armed force, on police prevention and presence, and on the regimentation of the population, whether or not with its consent. End of quote. Such a view strikes me as absurdly reductivist. I should stress at this juncture that I do not want in any way to minimize the considerable degree of opposition to fascism, above all in the early years, when thousands of socialists, communists, Catholics, and liberals were brutally assaulted and killed by fascist squads. Nor should we forget the tens of thousands who were forced into exile by the regime after 1922, and who often faced extreme hardship and persecution in exile. Nor should we overlook the persistent threat and practice of violence that underpinned the regime right to the end. Nor, too, should we underestimate the impact of the secret police in curbing expressions of dissent or dissatisfaction, or the impact of the punishment of confino, or internal exile. But my intention here is to concentrate on those huge swathes of Italians who did, with varying degrees of intensity and commitment, give their support to Mussolini and the regime, and to offer some suggestions as to what it was about fascism that attracted them. I want to begin with Mussolini himself. For in any assessment of the popularity of fascism, the cult of the Duce deserves special attention. And here we've got sort of images which relate to the cult. Top left, a sort of photo montage with various Mussolini's expressions. In the center, a statue of Mussolini. It's worth remembering that statues of Mussolini were all over the place. They almost all disappeared overnight between the 25th of July, 26th of July, 1943. But they were everywhere. And that that stamp on the top right shows a famous statue in the main football stadium in Bologna, equestrian statue of Mussolini. That was destroyed and melted down and turned into two partisans. There's now a statue of two partisans just outside Bologna, made from the bronze of that statue, though the head was kept by neo-fascists and is now in a private fascist museum in Bologna. And then you've got school textbook full of images of Mussolini. And bottom right, you've got a photograph of Predappio, Mussolini's hometown. As I mentioned a little bit later on, Predappio became a center for pilgrimages. They were seen very much as pilgrimages for thousands of people every day. Those who've been to Predappio probably won't quite recognize it because that arch on the center left was taken down. Mussolini himself did not like it. It seemed too triumphalist. And so the pilgrims would gather there and go, well, through the gap, not under the arch, up to the house, the top left, where Mussolini was born. But Predappio was an important part of the cult. So the cult was fostered strongly by the Fascist Party from 1925. It was nurtured through countless adulatory speeches, newspaper articles, pamphlets, and books. It insinuated itself deep into the school curriculum, especially at primary level. It was articulated with increasing momentum in the 1930s through ceremonies, rituals, choreographed parades, and set-piece speeches of the kind that Maria Theresa attended in September 1938. And it received an enormous, and to my mind, underestimated boost from the Catholic Church, which from 1925 publicly proclaimed Mussolini a man of providence, whose miraculous escape from 4 assassination attempts showed that he was divinely protected. The emotional intensity of the cult is evident in countless diaries and letters, and the intensity was fed by several streams. One, as Maria Theresa's diary suggests, was quite sensual. Mussolini's body, expressions, mannerisms were the subject of endless fascination, and the devotion that Italians were encouraged to feel and express towards the Duce often inhabited a curious marginal world between the sacred and the profane. Take, for instance, one of the innumerable letters sent to him by female admirers, in this case a young woman in Genoa, who wrote to him after listening to his speech on the radio on the 30th of March, 1938. Forgive me if I, just a humble woman, dare to write to you and use the familiar form of tu, but when I turn to God, I do not use the formal voi or lei, and you, tu, are for me a God, a supernatural being sent to us by a superior power to guide our beautiful Italy to the destiny assigned to it. Forgive me again, but my heart was so filled with enthusiasm by your divine words transmitted through the radio that I had to unburden myself and tell you of all the admiration and all the love that we women feel as well. My Duce, for a long time you've been talking of coming to Genoa, and I have such a desire to see you, even only at a distance, and confirm that you are not a myth, but a man, and hear for once your passionate words, not through the radio, but from your lips. I'm waiting for you soon, my Duce. This letter is preserved in one of the 122 enormous boxes marked Sentimenti per il Duce, good wishes for the Duce, in the archive of Mussolini's private secretariat in Rome. Only a fraction of the archive, which today totals 4,227 boxes, has been preserved. The vast majority of files were destroyed during the Second World War. Writing to Mussolini was a vital component, not just the cult of the Duce itself, but more generally the political and cultural fabric of the fascist regime as a whole. A few years ago, a German historian discovered in Moscow the archive of letters seized by the Red Army in 1945 that ordinary Germans had written to Hitler. When he published a selection, it caused eyebrows to be raised that the Führer had received as many as 1,000 letters a month. In the 1930s, Mussolini was receiving from men, women, and children all over the country, on average about 1,500 a day. with huge surges on occasions such as birthday, a foiled assassination attempt, a key political development, or when there was a birth, marriage, bereavement, or illness in his family. Around 50 civil servants were employed full-time to process this correspondence, deciding which letters to pass on to Mussolini himself, which ones to refer to a local prefect for additional information, and which ones to answer with a formulaic note of thanks. Writing to the Duce was strongly encouraged by the regime as a mark of faith, but as the intense language generally used by the writers shows, it was also seen as a mechanism for generating faith. Perhaps more importantly, though, it reinforced the idea of the Duce, and this is a vital element both of the cult and of the regime's broader apparatus of consent, as somebody sitting above the sordid fray of the everyday world to whom one could turn in the hope of support. As an article in the leading newspaper, the Corriere della Sera, said in 1936, "When do you write a letter to Mussolini? Not always, but on practically every occasion at a difficult time in your life. When you're looking around and don't know who to turn to anymore, you remember that he is there. Who but him can help you? The Duce knows that when you write to him, it is out of genuine sorrow or real need. He is the confidant of everyone, and as far as he can, he will help anyone. And where is the Duce? He's everywhere. He's anywhere. He's even, have you not felt it, in that gloomy little room downstairs where you, poor thing, were writing of your sufferings. Have you not felt that he was listening to you?" Of course, as I've indicated, Mussolini himself only dealt with a tiny fraction of the letters. But gifts of money, or clothing, or food were regularly handed out in the name of the Duce. And Mussolini himself assiduously encouraged the idea that he was keeping a watchful eye on the entire country. The editor of the main fascist daily, Il Popolo d'Italia, recalled how Mussolini once rang him after reading in a newspaper about a mother who was living with 10 children and a sick husband in a single room, and told him to send someone to the poor woman immediately with a gift of 3,000 lire in his name. The editor was told to report the episode in his newspaper the next day and to emphasize how Mussolini had spotted the story tucked away in a corner, quote, of one of the many newspapers he reads, and notwithstanding the huge burden of work that he was saddled with. This idea of an ever-vigilant Duce, deeply concerned about the welfare of his people, especially the poor, comes out in many sources, not least secret police reports. It sometimes had curious manifestations. For instance, the widely held belief, transmitted to this day through oral testimony, that Mussolini frequently rode around the Pontine marshes near Rome in disguise on his motorbike to find out how ordinary people were faring and provide them, if appropriate, with help. This aspect of the cult of the Duce, the sense that at the pinnacle of the regime was a providential figure working to rectify injustices, is crucially important in any evaluation of popular opinion under fascism. It is worth recalling how the phrase, "if only the Duce knew about it, se lo sapesse il Duce," was among the most commonly voiced remarks in the 1930s, and not, it would seem, one uttered or written in irony. And this idea of an omnipotent, if not omniscient, leader operated in a curious dialectical relationship with the harsh realities of everyday life. As party and police reports make abundantly clear, people were frequently angry about the economic situation in the country, and there was widespread and seemingly growing dismay from the later 1920s at the squalid character of local party organizations, widely seen as nests of corruption, clientelism, and factional disputes. But discontent with aspects of everyday life appear, although there's no clear algorithm for measuring this, to have intensified the wish to believe that the Duce could and would, in due course, make things better. A quite striking indication of this curious dialectic between reality and hope in relation to the figure of Mussolini is a huge volume of letters that continue to pour into the Secretariat during the Second World War, military reverses notwithstanding, with people pledging their commitment to the Duce and fascism. Here, for instance, is a Neapolitan woman writing in February 1941, after the Italian forces had been pushed back and humiliated by the Greek army. "Dear Duce, I hope this reaches you. My desire to communicate to you my unshakable faith in the final victory is so great. I understand your moments of painful anxiety in the supreme struggle, but I feel that you will overcome everything and everyone, because your law is divine law. In you I see an apostle of God. The prize for all you are doing for our dear fatherland you will receive from him. Everybody together would never be able to give you a sufficient reward. I continue to pray for you and for our dear fatherland." Similar letters fill the boxes of the Sentimenti per il Duce, right down to Mussolini's fall on the 25th of July, 1943. Very often, the trigger for writing was to report the birth of a new child, to whom they want to give a suitably loyal or patriotic name, Vincere, for instance, Italia, Romano, or Bruno, which became particularly popular after Mussolini's second son was killed in a flying accident in August 1941. And they often asked Mussolini to be the godfather. That the authors not infrequently chose to leave their letters unsigned or simply appended initials warns against assuming there might have been a mercenary motive for writing. An important corollary to this dimension of the cult of the Duce and to its operational force within the regime was the need to keep the image of Mussolini morally uncontaminated. The pervasive willingness to do this, in defiance very often of apparent common sense, is a measure arguably of the strength of the psychological impulses behind the cult, and also of the centrality of the cult to the overarching framework of adhesion and consent. If Italy was facing problems, difficulties, or disasters, be they bureaucratic, economic, or military, the fault was felt to lie not with Mussolini, but elsewhere, with the unreformed character of the Italian people that he was striving heroically to regenerate, with the League of Nations, dominated by the selfish, plutocratic democracies of Britain and France, who were doing all they could to maintain their international supremacy and deny Italy its rightful place in the sun, with the incompetent, corrupt, or idiotic ministers and advisors that unfortunately surrounded the Duce, the lackluster party secretary for much of the 1930s, Achille Starace, was a favorite whipping boy. So too was Mussolini's son-in-law, Galeazzo Ciano, Italy's foreign minister from 1936 to 1943, whose decadent lifestyle and wealth were a frequent source of anger. Let me give an example of the thought processes that went into this way of envisaging Mussolini in the regime. It comes from the diary of Paolino Ferrari, and this is a page from the diary. And as you can see, it's an important day, 10th of June 1940, and Paolino is very excited, as the writing indicates, by the outbreak of the Second World War, Italy's involvement in the Second World War. Paolino Ferrari was a highly educated property surveyor from Emilia-Romagna who had taken part in the March on Rome in 1922 and then served as a local party secretary. During the 1930s, he became increasingly disenchanted with the direction the regime was going. In 1938, he decided to start keeping a diary to record, as he put it, the betrayal of the fascist revolution and its leader by anti-fascist criminals. Mussolini, he wrote, had been, and I quote, like the founder of a universal religion. But, as all founders of religions, he has seen his work, and I quote again, polluted by the dishonesty of place seekers, profiteers, dealers, and windbags. End of quote. Starace was particularly at fault, he thought, having allowed the party to become corrupt and spiritually lifeless. Judaism, Freemasonry, the rich democracies, and the persistence of bourgeois values were also to blame for Italy's continuing difficulties. And he wrote passionately the need to fight what he described as, I quote, the Masonic, Jewish, and Xenophile rot of anti-fascism and the mercantile spirit of the middle classes. Paolino did allow himself to wonder at times in his diary if Mussolini personally could have done more to improve things and curb the likes of Starace and Ciano. But Mussolini, he thought, was simply on a different moral and intellectual plane, and so heavily preoccupied with big political questions that he regarded, and I quote, the miserable little men who fool around with decorations, uniforms, and Camorra intrigues in the same way as Christopher Columbus would have regarded the rats and cockroaches living in the bilges of the vessels on his famous expedition. End quote. In other words, to be tolerated as long as it did not pose a danger to the enterprise. It was thus almost certain, Paolino wrote, that, I quote, as soon as the Duce reached port, he would, like the good captain that he is, see to a total cleansing of the ship, with special disinfection of the most dubious parts. It is often suggested that the cult of the Duce was a surrogate for any serious ideological content in Italian fascism. Fascism, it is said, in contrast to Nazi Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union, lacked emotionally compelling, big ideas that could engage the masses and carry them through hardship and disappointment. The evidence of diaries and letters suggests to me that this is not the case. It is certainly true that on the economic front, the regime did not deliver as much as many might have hoped. It is also undoubtedly true that the Fascist Party proved frustratingly inefficient and corrupt, and the extension of the state's activities did not go hand in hand with any significant increase in the quality of the bureaucracy and the public services. And it's also true that the rewards of empire, Libya, Somalia, and Ethiopia, turned out to be far less than many had hoped or believed. But I think that an essentially utilitarian assessment of what the regime did or did not achieve risks overlooking those aspects of fascism that resonated, and resonated powerfully, with millions of Italians. And far from being a substitute for ideology, I would suggest that the cult of Duce derived much of its force from a sense that in the rarefied figure of Mussolini lay a spectrum of ideals, values, and aspirations that chimed with broad swathes of the population, and which could be seen as encapsulating what it was that fascism meant in principle, if not always in practice. Let's turn back to Maria Theresa Rossetti, the young woman from Padua who found herself cheering Mussolini almost uncontrollably in September 1938. One of the very interesting features of Maria Theresa's diary is the evidence it provides of an internal struggle between rationality and emotion, reason and faith. As a teenager, she found herself continually being encouraged at school both to feel and to display enthusiasm for the Duce, for fascism, and for Italy. Yet she was instinctively reflective and restrained, and her home environment was rather sober, with neither of her parents showing too much passion for politics. All this troubled her. When she did find herself experiencing emotional release, she was hugely relieved. Thus, in December 1932, she recorded her joy at feeling swept up in patriotic demonstrations in the streets of Padua against Yugoslavia. She had a strong sensation, as she recorded in her diary, of being, and I quote, united in a single faith with all the Italians and prepared to give my life for the great fatherland. She now understood, she wrote, what patriotism really meant. It meant, as she put it, the annihilation of the individual in order to be born again in the universal life of the fatherland. And she had a similar sense of an epiphany some 18 months later while listening to the radio, to a live radio broadcast of a gymnastics display in Rome to mark the 19th anniversary of Italy's entry into the First World War. She was overcome, she wrote in her diary, by a powerful sensation, a sensation, again, of belonging to a radiant whole. The whole of Italy, she wrote, appeared to me to be stretching out in its blue sea under its golden sun, with thousands of strong, smiling children on it, as the clear and incisive words of Duce greeted them and gave them words of encouragement and comfort. The idea and experience of enthusiasm or faith, which the regime continually placed at the pinnacle of required fascist virtues, encapsulated in the slogan, believe, obey, fight, for very understandable reasons, struck a deep chord with many Italians. And the evidence of diaries and letters suggests that far from competing with conventional religious faith, fascism, in marked contrast to the liberal regime, derived considerable emotional charge from being able to map onto the templates and the language of the Catholic Church. In addition to faith, the regime celebrated, among other things, spirituality, anti-materialism, austerity, sobriety of behavior, fecundity, obedience to authority, selflessness, martyrdom, and the union of the living and the dead. It drew continual parallels in school textbooks and elsewhere between Mussolini's humble origins and those of Christ, and encouraged Italians to relate to the leader as if to someone sent by God. The idea of the man of providence was already very much in the air in 1922 and rapidly gained momentum, as mentioned earlier, from 1925. And the ideological coordinates were buttressed formally, whether in letters or invocations to Duce framed as supplications or prayers, or in the liturgical language and practices of fascist rituals, or in pilgrimages, I mentioned before, to Mussolini's hometown of Prodapio, which from the later 1920s were carefully orchestrated along the lines of those to shrines such as Loreto or Assisi. By the early 1930s, thousands were each day making the trip to the Romagna town, which had been specially rebuilt for the purpose, visiting the bedroom in the small house where Mussolini had been born, with its mattress stuffed with maize leaves, hearing Mass in honor of the Duce's parents, and visiting the cemetery where they were buried. The sense of a continuum between the political and religious spheres was, of course, hugely underlined by the very visible and active backing of the church, the regime, almost from the outset. This is undoubtedly an enormously important element in shaping popular support for the regime, one whose significance has often, as I've suggested earlier, been underestimated. In part, I would think, because of a misleading interpretation of the relationship between fascism and the church as one of intrinsic antithesis and struggle. There were, of course, tensions, but as diaries and letters constantly suggest, the principal dynamic was felt to be one not of competition, but rather of mutual affirmation. Let me take an episode from a very interesting example, that of a Florentine hotel manager called Carlo Cesari, a man who served in the First World War and become completely disenchanted with politics and politicians until he heard Mussolini give a speech in Milan in 1920. Thereafter, he was totally captivated by the Duce. In October 1934, to mark the 12th anniversary of fascism's advent to power, a lavish ceremony was staged in Florence to reinter 37 so-called fascist martyrs in the crypt of Santa Croce Church. This is Hitler visiting Italy in May 1938. He's taken on tour of the Sacrario, which was destroyed, I presume, in 1945. I'm not sure, maybe before, perhaps 44, after Florence is liberated. The press marked the event with characteristic prose. The entire Italian soul, said a leading article in the city's main newspaper, is preparing itself for this rite, reaching out towards it as to a supreme and intimate source of religious energy. The civil liturgy of fascism testifies to the discipline of the masses and their great faith in the Duce. The religious character of the occasion was reinforced through the high-profile involvement of senior clergy in the day's proceedings. Carlo was hugely excited, not least because the event offered him a chance to see Mussolini, whom he described in his diary in 1923 as, and I quote, the superior being sent by God to restore peace to us and perhaps also the honors and glories of ancient Rome. Carlo put on his army uniform and hurried towards the city center. As he wrote in his diary that evening, and I quote, I was thinking as I went through the streets that today I would be able to hear the living voice of Mussolini. A great day, an exceptional day, a day of joy for me. End of quote. But something went badly wrong, and he returned home in anguish. Exactly what happened is not clear, but in all likelihood, the problem lay in the fact that proceedings were rigorously controlled by the fascist party. Carlo was not a party member, never had been, and it seems that his commitment to fascism had somehow been questioned. He was left distraught and turned to his diary to unburden himself. It is true, he wrote, that I am not a member, but that does not count. It should not count. What really matters is faith, believing. And I believe, I firmly believe. Faith and its attendant power to affirm and comfort seems to many to have been an important element in their support for Mussolini and more broadly for fascism. Let me take two letters, more or less at random, from the boxes of the Sentimenti per il Duce, at this stage for reflection rather than any analysis. The first is from a semi-literate peasant woman from a village near Cosenza, whose brother had been killed in Ethiopia in January 1936, with, I quote, the name of your excellency and of our Italy on his lips. That's what she writes to Mussolini. But my eyes are not weeping. Although I am just a poor peasant woman for whom his arms, as a brother's arms, were very precious, as they were strong and helped me to cultivate the small field that I rent, I nevertheless feel boundless pride that one of my blood has offered himself up of his own will to his Duce and the fatherland, heroically sacrificing himself. And may the selfish and arrogant world know that the poor and noble women of Italy are, and always will be, ready to offer up their lives too, at one sign from your excellency. The second letter is from Franco Oldrini, who, in April 1941, in the course of the campaign in Greece, was hit by a mortar and had to have a leg amputated. Shortly after the operation, he wrote to Mussolini to say that his spirit was still strong, his morale very high, and his love of the Duce more than great. With a pure and great faith you have instilled in us, Duce, with the love of a son for his father, of a fascist for his Duce, of a black shirt for his leader, I took up my rifle, Duce, Attached to my bed is your effigy of when you were wounded in the First World War. It's quite a famous photograph of Mussolini in 1917 on crutches after he's wounded in a mortar accident. When you were wounded in the First World War and were on crutches, and I kiss your crutches, which I will soon have to use. I kiss them with passion because making myself equal to you in physical suffering, I will come to resemble you more in the ideal. For the blood given in your name to the fatherland, for the willing gift of my limb, Duce, I thank you. In summary, as I suggested, it seems to me that fascism had a much stronger ideological and emotional underpinning than has often been suggested. It tapped into deep well springs of popular belief and religiosity, and had its own so-called big ideas, ideas that provide a kind of subterranean platform beneath the very visible layer of complaints and protests in everyday life, and which could help to sustain a measure of support for the regime through hardship and reverses. The sense that fascism was founded on a set of core values that were intrinsically superior to those of liberalism and socialism is an important consideration here. Time and again in diaries and letters, we find people taking comfort from the idea that fascism was built around such ideas as faith, spirituality, enthusiasm, and selflessness, and that through these key values, Italy had finally achieved the sense of moral unity that has so long eluded it, a unity cemented by the conciliation with the Church. And I think in this context, we need to reconsider the supposed downward trajectory of the regime from 1936. Of course, the growing alliance with Germany, the slide towards war, and the increasingly extreme measures adopted by the regime, notably the racial laws, all caused varying degrees of anxiety and dismay. But they were framed for many, as letters and diaries indicate, by a sense of the intrinsic superiority of fascist ideology and belief there should be, and hopefully could be, a better world order in Europe. It is striking in this context to read the innumerable letters that members of the public and soldiers wrote to Mussolini in 1940, 1941, 1942, and 1943, in which the war is seen as the just pursuit by a proletarian and morally superior nation for a fairer international order, an order based on peace with justice, as it was commonly referred to, and end the selfish domination of the West by plutocratic liberal democracies and the threat posed in the East by communism, both ideologies that were widely seen not just as corrosively materialistic, but also as instruments of Freemasonry and Judaism. Of course, the war shattered any illusions about the triumph of fascism. In 1944, surrounded by the debris of defeat and civil war, a young university graduate, later to be a distinguished philosopher, Alberto Caracciolo, reflected on why he and almost all his contemporaries in the prestigious Ghislieri College in Pavia had not opposed Mussolini and the regime. He admitted that not all the students had been fervent. While some, he said, had experienced fascism, and I quote, as a true religion, a view of life, others had evinced a cooler and less committed attitude. But the fact remained that almost nobody, as far as he could tell, had in any serious sense been an anti-fascist. He himself, as a middle-class Catholic from a family that had no particularly strong political views, could see there was so much that was unattractive about the regime. He disliked the raucous party rallies, the blind adoration of the Duce, and the way in which fascism presented itself, as he put it, as a total conception, as a religion, with the state as its god and the war as, quote, supreme act of the cult. But despite these feelings, he'd been unable to identify within himself sufficient moral grounds for rejecting a doctrine that was, as he said, and I quote, present everywhere and was acclaimed by all. Indeed, rather like Maria Theresa Rossetti, he had blamed himself for his failure to share the general enthusiasm. I made every effort, he wrote, to feel that love, but in vain. And I regarded this failure as a shortcoming of my moral being. And this sense of guilt was underpinned by intellectual doubt. Was it possible, he wrote, that millions and millions of people were deluded and that I alone, or that small group of opponents that I knew, was right? Was it not more likely that we were wrong? But it was not just collective pressure that had impelled him towards conformity. There had also been elements within the value system of the regime that had attracted him and left his moral defenses blunted. One was the fact that fascism presented itself as a heroic, self-sacrificing, and difficult ideology, and branded its enemies as egotistical and cowardly. Such an image had resonated with Alberto. After all, he said, what young man would have wanted to risk being seen as weak, selfish, and materialistic by his peers? More important still for Alberto had been the centrality of faith to fascism. This he recognized to be a determining factor in his acceptance of the regime and his rejection of liberal doctrines, which, with their celebration of individual choice and reasoning, posed a threat, he said, to the religious sphere. Alberto recognized that this central kernel of fascism had been on one level a source of huge political strength in attracting support and blunting opposition, but also been the regime's Achilles heel. It had nurtured a culture in which criticism was not only stifled by law, but also morally frowned upon. And more worryingly, he thought, it had produced a strange disjuncture between words and reality. People wildly cheered the speeches of Mussolini, with their invocations of war and violence, without much sense of the reality to which those words might relate. Fascism had encouraged people to believe and obey, and individuals had been stripped of personal responsibility. Authority flowed from above. In a dictatorial regime, he reflected, you get used to the idea that everything has to happen according to the will of the leader. As a result, he admitted, words had become curiously detached from what they were meant to signify. The headiness of enthusiasm had served to drown out criticism and doubt, and the country had allowed itself to slide towards disaster. Surrounded in 1944 by the greatest disaster in Italy's history, Alberto Caracciolo could recognize how crucial it was to reflect on why fascism had for nearly a generation kept millions of Italian men, women, and children in thrall, and not just through coercion or constraint. 70 years later, in far more propitious and benign circumstances in Europe, with extremism and extremist ideas still displaying enormous allure in various parts of the world, it is surely important, indeed necessary, for historians to reflect on and openly discuss what it was that appealed and resonated in Italian fascism. Thank you.
We'll open the floor for questions.
Yes, please do.
Question. We were just talking to Ruth Bendia today, and she's doing some work about fascism also. And she was talking about how difficult it was for her to access archives, and that until the 90s, really, the Italian archives were pretty much closed, especially to non-Italians. So I wanted to ask you what you experienced in trying to find, primary sources and looking at the archives.
Yeah. I think I imagine Ruth was talking primarily about the archives relating to the colonies, which have been very difficult to access indeed. And there is, as you probably know, there are many, many cans of worms there which have not been divulged. I didn't have too many problems. It was interesting when I came across these boxes of papers about the sentimenti per il Duce to realize they hadn't been touched since the 1930s, because you could see the civil servants had put pins in the papers, and the rust marks weren't exactly where they've been before. People hadn't looked at them, so I don't think people have gone to those papers before. In the case of the diaries, I thought I would have had more problems than I did. The problem with the diaries is that most of them are in an archive in Pieve San Stefano, beyond Arezzo, beyond San Sepolcro. And strictly speaking, the diaries are deposited there for public use, but they belong still to the families. And if you want to quote the diaries, obviously issues about what quoting means, but if you want to significantly quote the diaries, you have to get permission from the owners of the diaries, usually descendants of the person who wrote the diary. And I thought I had trouble there. I explained what my project was, and in most cases they gave their consent. In a few cases, not, but there it is. But yeah, I think, there are problems with archives still. I think particularly to do with the army. And that's where the colonies become particularly difficult. People say that to find out really what went on in Ethiopia between 36 and 41 is still very hard. And I was talking to David at the beginning about a mutual friend of ours who working in Ethiopia, trying to really get some focus on the appalling massacres that took place in Ethiopia, particularly in 1937, which he says are very hard to talk about, even in Addis Ababa. And he mentioned to me when I saw him a year or so ago that I think it was in 2007, he and some colleagues in Addis Ababa University tried to put on a photographic exhibition to commemorate the massacre in February 1937, when in the space of 2 days, around about somewhere between 10,000 and 15,000 local people were massacred by fascist militia. That exhibition had to be stopped under pressure from Italian authorities. So there are particular issues relating to colonies. We know, for example, the film The Lion in the Desert, which anyone seen The Lion in the Desert? You have, right? But it is not screened in Italy. It is technically banned in Italy. Sorry, do you want to? Yes, okay. Yeah, sorry, all right, afterwards, yeah. So there are great sensitivities about I mean, that was banned by Andreotti, I think, on the grounds it was defaming to the Italian army. It's historically a very accurate film. I was in Egypt a few years ago, and I just happened to mention to my Egyptian guide this film, and he said, it's my favorite film, I've seen it 10 times. He's seen it 10 times, most Italians don't know about it at all. And it's a very accurate portrayal of what happened in the early 1930s with the suppression at the hands of Graziani of the Senussi Rising by Omar al-Muqta, and has people like Anthony Quinn in it. I think Ralph Richardson's there, John Gielgud, it's an extraordinary cast of people. Oliver Reed plays Graziani. Rod Steiger plays Mussolini. International film, banned in Italy. So the colonies are still a very sensitive issue. And I think that needs, I mean, just one before I go to one question, but I was reading a couple of months ago a book by a popular Italian historian called Rio Petacco, who has big sales, a lot of influence. This was a book that came out a few years ago called Facetta Nera, which you might imagine is about the Ethiopian War. Published by Mondadori, probably has sales running to tens of thousands. And as I went through this book, I found virtually every page putting an exclamation mark. I just couldn't believe it. This book, published in 2003, just, first of all, poison gas is mentioned, but is deemed to be, it says it's not clear if it's used or not, for goodness sake. One point he says, this was the most glorious and successful colonial war in European history. And he says there's evidence of partial, one reason for this is that only less than 3,000 Italians were killed. Of course, he doesn't mention the figures for Ethiopians, which run possibly up to 250,000 or more. So there's still really big areas which are not discussed in Italy. Sorry.
So usually the scholars who are working with such topic as popular opinion, especially in dictatorial regimes,
Right.
they face the problem, I would say, epistemological problem. Do your sources allow to measure the balance between dissent and support of the regime, or it is only impressionistic possibility?
It's a very good point. I mean, what is a realistic sample? I mean, what I did, when I went to this archive diary, and I used a couple others as well, but the main ones in Pietro San Stefano, I just tried to find all the diaries that related to the fascist period. And there were several hundred. I didn't, a lot for 43, 45, the resistance period, and I looked at some of those, but I concentrated on the period up to 43. And okay, there are a few hundred. And what I found surprising within that, I thought, given that these were diaries that were deposited by the individuals who wrote them, or by the families, that there would be overwhelmingly diaries of an anti-fascist character. There were some, but they were a very small minority. And I did in the book try to, as I said, I tried to reflect the balance. And of course, I can't tell if the few hundred diaries deposited there that relate to the fascist period are representative. But and that's something that the Gentile said, how can we possibly know, what I think what you do is try and look at the internal testimony in the diaries, and very often you find people writing diaries precisely because they feel quite isolated. That a lot of the diaries are doing so because, a bit like Maria Theresa Rossetti, they don't quite share the prevalent values. And so, in a sense, from within the diaries, you get a sort of sense of that person feeling out of step with other people who are even more in tune with the regime than the writer feels that he or she is. It can't be scientific. I cannot say. And of course, you could. And this book, I said, is about those people primarily who expressed support. You could write a completely different book, which focuses on, uses the testimony of the 15,000 confinati, or what it is, to give a picture of opposition. But, we know that there is very little organized opposition around still by late 30s. Of course, repression has taken hold in a big way. But, fascism is there for 20 years. It is a totalitarian regime that controls, radio. Every country is suffused with this stuff. It's very hard, certainly for people of the younger generation. Obviously, the old generation, we can see. There's a very nice diary of, which I haven't quoted this evening, of a teenage girl near, I think it's near Cremona, somewhere up there. And her father is an old socialist. And what's very nice in this diary is the sort of picture you get of a father who still, he takes his daughter out in the countryside and he sings old anarchist songs to her. He's nostalgic and so on. And she says, why? For God's sake, stop it. What's wrong with fascism? And he said, well, yeah, I know there are lots of good things and so on and so forth. But she said, I can't understand you. I love fascism, she says. I love my uniform. I love all these things. So you get this sort of generational, interplay between. Older people. There will be all, particularly in the north, elements of old patterns of thought. But as I say, it's a regime that lasted 20 years, and for Gentile to say that it's just, survived because of repression and so on, seems to me ridiculous. You look at just the films that we started, like one we start off with. Either you say people are regimented, which of course they were to a degree. We know that a lot of workers in factories and so on had their party cards down to make sure they turned up for rallies and so on and so forth. You can say that when they smiled or laughed or cheered or whatever it is, they were being cynical or just saying it's a joke or whatever it is. You could try and say that when people wrote to the Duce, that they had tongue-in-cheek. Possibly. There are ways in which, there are methodological issues, just as there are quantitative issues in these things. And we can debate these without ever coming to a definitive answer. But it is obviously a very important point how representative these can be. And so you could do a very different book from the anti-fascist perspective using different diaries. I chose to look at the diaries where people are expressing support with a view to trying to see what it was about the regime that attracted them.
I just read David Kurzer's recent book about the church and Mussolini, and which is also just recently translated in Italian and met with deafening silence.
Yeah.
And that's a book that deals with exchanges between the government and the church at the very highest levels. I was wondering if in the materials you studied, if you registered any discomfort at this kind of deep
It comes out occasionally. Yes, it does come out. There are undoubtedly people who are uncomfortable about. There's a diary which I quote quite extensively for the campaign in Ethiopia. It's a young man from, I think, sort of Christian socialist background, who loved reading Victor Hugo and so on, and Tolstoy. But he in the end is disgusted by the role played by the church in Ethiopia, the way in which the soldiers all go to attend masses regularly and so on and so forth. And he in the end opts out. He says, I can't go ahead with this. I can't understand how all the other soldiers can do this. The church should not be supporting a war which is just so brutal and sees people being massacred in their tens of thousands and use of poison gas and so on and so forth. So you get these voices, but he's somebody saying, look, everyone else is doing it, I can't go along with it. But the fact is, he sees the reality. So you do get voices. Yes, there are undoubtedly people who find there is a basic disjuncture between what the church should be doing and what it is doing. But not as many as I thought. And I say, I think it is quite extraordinary. I mean, we know that Pius XI had increasing difficulties in the 30s about the alliance with fascism, but because of his increasing fears about Germany. I mean, he signed up to fascism as we know, he became Pope in February 22. I think he spotted that fascism was something he could do business with. I mean, of course, there was a huge amount of violence directed towards the popularity, towards Catholic unions, and so on and so forth. But I think, we need to bear in mind that the church, obviously in Italy, has a very distinctive place and role. And there is a long concern in the Catholic Church, going back to the mid-18th century, about the direction in which European thought is going. The Enlightenment, French Revolution. French Revolution spawns nationalism, liberalism, and it gets worse and worse, socialism, culminating with communism. And Pius, who's been in Poland during the First World War and seen the first sackings of churches by communists and so on and so forth, is somebody who shares predecessors a sense that Europe has become profoundly sick. And the First World War is sort of evidence of how sick Europe has got. And when he becomes Pope in 22, he, like his predecessors, and indeed his successor, Pius XII, is hoping still to try and refound Christian civilization. And Italy has a distinctive position in this, of course, as the home of the papacy. And he sees Mussolini as someone he can do business with quite early on. And I think, if one looks at what happens during the Matteotti crisis, for example, it's the church is absolutely crucial. The Pope himself is absolutely crucial in keeping Mussolini afloat in the second half of 24 by saying, we're not going to have this popularity back. We back you entirely. And of course, this again is something very difficult to discuss in Italy. And it's intriguing, for example, you mentioned David Kurtz's book, and he mentioned, I asked him a few months ago what he thought his reception would be, and he said, well, he's shown the book to various Italian friends, and the collusion between the church and fascism didn't shock them. What they might be interested in is the evidence of paedophiles in the Vatican. That might have raised an eyebrow or two, but it is a very difficult subject to discuss, and it's intriguing that so many Italians not mention the church in contact when writing about fascism. When they do, and there's a very curious book by Emilio Gentile, who's a very good historian. I have a lot of time for Gentile, but one of his more curious books is a book called Contra Cesare, which is about the links between the Catholic Church and Italian fascism and also Nazism. But what's very curious about the way he writes about the links between the Catholic Church and Italian fascism is he says, his sort of thesis is that really the Catholic Church ought not to have been backing fascism. It ought to have seen that there was a deeply pagan element, as was manifestly the case in the case of Nazism, but nonetheless it did. But what is very curious about the book is that Gentile focuses on three leading Catholic anti-fascists, Don Sturzo, Marco Ferrari, I think, who's with Don Sturzo in exile, and a well-known Catholic anti-fascist priest called Primo Mazzolari. So you come away from this book with having read huge amounts from Sturzo, Ferrari, and Mazzolari about anti-fascism. You realize that that's not the point of the book. So it's almost as if he didn't dare say overtly that the Catholic Church colluded with and supported fascism, and here's the evidence. He sort of says that it probably shouldn't have done. Nevertheless, here's lots of evidence from three slightly rather isolated voices. So it's almost as if people can't do it, and okay, it is difficult, but I think it's something that we can't ignore. Anyway, we can. Yeah, David. Yeah.
Well, just 2 points in your talk I'd really like to hear you elaborate a bit, if you can. The first is, I was very struck with some of the letters you quote look like devotional letters. Devotional letters,
yes.
like letters.
Yes.
The Neapolitan woman who wrote in February 41, "Your law is divine law, in you I see an apostle of God." And then the man who wrote to the cardinal, or somebody who describes Mussolini as a superior being sent by God. So either addressing them in this way or referring to him as a divine being. And then other letters, particularly I think that first one you quoted from Maria Theresa Rossetti, where she talks about seeing him in Padua, and it's a bit like a letter to a movie star. It's a very heavy erotic charge, your strength, but also your gentleness. And as we know, a lot of the letters written in the 30s to film stars, of which there are large stashes in the Hollywood archives, are of that kind. So it does seem to be that there's elements of the very old kind of devotional cult, and also elements of a sort of modern movie star cult. And I wondered if you felt that there's this kind of co-presence of the secular and the religious aspect of the cult, and how you might see them. Are they just two sides of the same coin, or do you see them as different with different kind of letter writers? Perhaps the religious ones might be more Catholic, and perhaps more peasant women, and the other ones might be from. Anyway, that's the first. Can I just get in my second question, which is this point you make in your talk, which other historians have made, that we need to distinguish between support for fascism and support for Mussolini. They're not the same thing. I think your book shows that very well. That when things are going badly, it's not Mussolini's fault. In fact, it must in some ways be corrupt party officials or bad leaders or bad army leaders who have kind of misled him, but he will put things right. And I find this extraordinary thing, which also you see, of course, in early modern cults of kings. That, kings can't be fallible, but they're advisors, or they have corrupt courts. And I just wondered, at what point do you think that breaks down, and in some ways the anger really does turn towards Mussolini? I mean, we know how it ends. It ends on 29th of April 1945 with this huge crowd kicking and smashing the skull of Mussolini and gets out of April. Whereas 5 years earlier, just a little less than 5 years earlier, a huge crowd was still in Rome and supported the entry into the war. So is the kind of breakdown of the cult something that happens in 44 or 45, or do you think it doesn't really happen?
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, David. Yes. I mean, I think. I mean, the film diaries. I mean, there are a number of diaries where and letters where people. Not so much letters. I think because when people write to the Duce, I think the balance is more towards the sort of traditional, reverential, religious. I mean, you've got to be a little bit careful about being too. Well, actually, not. No, that's not entirely true, because we know that there's one woman who wrote, I think, 900 love letters to Mussolini. And so writing sexually explicit letters to Duce did happen quite a lot, and people wanted an encounter, and they got them very often. God knows how many legitimate children we have, don't we know the full total. but that was, so there are explicitly erotic ones with people wanting to meet him, wanting just have sex with him, and that, as I say, happen on a daily basis. You know. There are the more sort of conventional religious ones, but as we know, traditional religious language does have a quite strong sexual element in it. I mean, Bernini's famous St. Teresa in Ecstasy is an example of where religious ecstasy and physical ecstasy. So there is always, I think, or very often, in devotional writings and prayers, quite often a very central element. But there's certainly, one of the appeals of Mussolini was that he was on newsreels, bare-chested, and there are a lot of diaries from adolescent girls in particular that just, extraordinary what they say. I mean, there's one which I didn't quote, which is one of the diaries I thought I had difficulty with because she was still alive. She was essentially from Tuscany. She became quite a well-known writer. At Gracchi, and when she knew I was writing this book, she was in touch with me, and I did wonder whether she remembered what she'd written as a teenage girl in her diaries. She died, sadly, last year, I think, last year. But she's an extraordinary diary that she kept when she was 17, 18, just before the Second World War. And a lot of the diaries about her love affair with the man she eventually marries, called Enzo. But what is extraordinary is the way in which that love affair is in tandem with her feelings for Italy as it moves towards the war, La Patria, and for the Duce. And they play off each other. So that at one point when she breaks off her affair with Enzo, she writes about how, in a sense, she now feels liberated because she has time to focus on her love for La Patria and above all for the Duce. And then she talks about how the Duce mi fa fremere, he makes me tremble every time I hear his voice, and it becomes extraordinarily sort of erotic and charged. And that's not the only one. There are quite a few of these where the sort of there's a quote in my book, quite nice memoir of someone became a school teacher, but was a passionate fascist. And she recalls a conversation with a friend of hers at school when they were both teenagers, and this friend of hers, suddenly turns and says, "Do you like Mussolini?" And said, "Of course I like Mussolini, I love him, I adore him. But I mean, do you really like him as physically?" And she gets really concerned. This friend of hers had obviously seen the newsreels of Mussolini's torso. She said, "That's my ideal man. That's the person I really love to embrace. He's my ideal. He's so strong and handsome." And the friend is rather confused about this. How can you possibly see Mussolini as this sort of sexual figure? But clearly that is part of the appeal. And we know that Mussolini goes out of his way to, he has no qualms about displaying his torso. Hitler finds that rather shameful, but Mussolini does it. And it's somewhere in the equation of the cult. It's part of the appeal. And then your second question, it's very hard to document. I think most historians now think that real disengagement with the regime only begins in the second half of 1942. What you find is there's a sort of, in diaries, this growing silence that people have written about Mussolini and how they still have faith in victory and in Mussolini up until then, grow silent, not angry, but just bemused, and realizing that things are going to go badly wrong. And then how do we explain the outpourings on the 25th to 26th of July 43, when people do throw out images of Mussolini? I mean, there's a kind of iconoclasm on a massive scale that takes place there. And I think it's very hard to unpick those feelings and what it means. I think it's obviously in Badoglio and his successors, Bonomi and so on, often turn to the public outpourings of apparent anger on 25th, 26th July to demonstrate how Italy had turned against fascism. I think it's difficult. I mean, there are lots of, obviously the main emotion, or the main hope 25th, 26th July is for peace. I mean, I think it's wrong to see it simply as a moment of anti-fascism. People are desperate for peace. And what does smashing the insignia of fascism, smashing the photographs of Duce, show in that context? Does it mean anti-fascism, or is it a cry of desperation to the outside world? Look, for God's sake, stop the bombing. I think I'll be careful about seeing it as a sort of, as a rupture in a clear sense. And also, a lot of commentators at the time noticed there was a really rather bizarre carnival atmosphere around. It wasn't really hatred. The people who got targeted, well, actually, very few individuals were targeted. Practically no one was seriously assaulted or attacked on 25th, 26th of July. The houses of fascists who felt to be corrupt and had been hoarding food, or thought to be hoarding food, were broken into. But very little evidence of violence. And someone like Piero Camandrea is interesting in his reflection, saying, this is just a sign that we're still not a mature political people, that we're not expressing real anger for what's happened. It's carnival atmosphere. People are parading the streets with sort of puppets of Mussolini and dancing and so on. It's odd. It's not really, they think, a sort of rejection of fascism. So I think we've got great difficulties in unpicking all these sort of emotions going around. But as I say, in contrast to what's still often said, that really people pull away from fascism from 36. That's obviously a very comfortable line that is still pushed. It's much more problematic than that, I think. And, of course people were concerned about the racial laws. Of course they were concerned about the alliance with Hitler. Of course they're concerned about the war. I mean, who wouldn't be? But does that mean they're becoming anti-fascist? No. And I think most people would say that the moment with real signs of disjuncture of some sort in the second half of 42, when after Stalingrad, the reversals in North Africa, it's becoming pretty apparent.
I have a question about the post-war years that you mentioned earlier on. You said in the beginning of your talk that the way people looked at fascism and at Mussolini did shape very much people's opinion after the war. And I was wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on what sense and what actually happened after 1955.
That's another whole book, I think, which I'm just right at the moment. Well, just briefly, what did happen? All right, there was enormous drive, partly encouraged by the Allies in 44 to 45 for a degree of epurazione, and so the Bonomi government in particular in the second half of 44 to early 45 pushed for that. But what we find in the second half of 45 is the beginnings of enormous withdrawal from that drive for anti-fascism. You have the amnesty of June 1946, which Togliatti introduces. The courts, particularly the Supreme Court's cassation, bend over backwards to acquit fascists who before had been prosecuted and found guilty of atrocities. We know that of the 1,200 Italians wanted by Yugoslavia, Albania, France, Ethiopia, Libya, for alleged war crimes, not one of those is extradited and faces trial. No, they don't. None of them does. A few are prosecuted for collaborationism in 43, 45. Graziani, for example, head of the armed forces in 43 to 45, is found guilty of collaborationism and sentenced to 19 years in prison, but is always immediately released. He doesn't serve much time in prison at all. Graziani does not face trial for any of the crimes, alleged crimes for which he is wanted by the Ethiopians and the Libyans. And from 47, 48, even 48, I think we can say that the Republic is not based on anti-fascism, but anti-communism. And anti-fascism goes into the background. Of course, it's kept alive. The various pulses, it increases in the 60s, there's silence in much of the 50s. In the 60s, there is, the Communist Party in particular is pushing to get resistance remembered and commemorated much more strongly. Anti-fascism comes back. But of course, the problem with anti-fascism is that it's so much identified with one party, which leaves it vulnerable, particularly after 89, as we know. And I think it's, you're probably aware of the, mentioning Graziani, that about 2 years ago, 2 years ago, in the town where Graziani lived much of his life, in a place called Affile, near Rome, at public expense, a shrine, a mausoleum has been set up to the memory of Graziani. If you look at the YouTube pictures of the inauguration of that event in August 2012 in Affile, for a historian, it's extraordinary that the man who, probably more than any other, incarnates the most vicious aspects of Italian fascism, the most brutal of the fascist generals, the man wanted for countless alleged war crimes, was actually sentenced to 19 years for collaboration. Look at that video and see the ordinary men, women, and children, both milling in the streets, coming to hear a seminar given by a priest, Don Innocenti, celebrating Graziani as a great patriot, a man that young people should look up to for his sense of la patria, honor, and so on. Some disjuncture here, which is curious. Could that have happened in Germany? Of course not. So there is something going on here about the way in which the memories of fascism have been transmitted, and there hasn't been, still, curiously, after so long, in contrast, of course, to Germany from the 1960s. In contrast, increasingly with Spain, France, again, since the 1960s, 70s, there hasn't been really still, and everyone says this, a real reckoning with fascism. And those historians in Italy who very bravely write about what happened in Ethiopia, Libya, Del Book, all racial laws like Gotti and Sarfati, what they often lament is the fact that they're talking to each other. It's very hard to get what they're saying out to the general public because there's no appetite in the media, in television, whatever, for any open discussion of these things still.